Transgender is an umbrella term that can be used to describe individuals whose birth sex does not align with their self-defined gender identity. For example, if a person is born female but identifies as male, or born male and identifies as female, they are transgender. Genderqueer, gender fluid, and gender nonconforming are some other words used to describe people who may feel they are both male and female, neither male nor female, or a different gender altogether.
Transgender is an umbrella term in my language, in my experience, and it incorporates basically anyone who wants to identify as transgender. It's all about self-identity.
To me, a transgender person is a person who does not identify with the gender role that was assigned to their birth sex and may or may not take like a somatic kind of intervention against themselves. They may undergo some sort of physical transition, or they may just undergo like a social transition, or they may not.
There are people that strongly feel like, that they're trapped in the wrong body. But then there's also a lot of people who are genderqueer, gender fluid, androgynous, where maybe they don't align with one gender or the other. Maybe they reject gender entirely. Maybe they feel like they're both male and female or something in between. So there's a lot of gender diversity across the spectrum of trans identity.
I think anyone could potentially identify as trans, anyone who doesn't identify with the sort of restrictions that go, or the sort of baggage that goes with either being a man or a woman. So I think, there are lots of identities that fall in that. You could be transsexual, meaning you're sort of like changing your sex through medical or hormonal technologies. You could be just sort of mixing and matching clothing or hairstyles, things like that. You could be like a butch lesbian or a sort of more feminine gay man. A whole variety of things could potentially, a whole variety of people could potentially identify as transgender.
Just recently I was introduced to the concept of mandatory pronouns as opposed to preferred pronouns, which I find kind of amusing. So my mandatory pronouns are he, because preferred implies there is some other option. I use male pronouns, he, him, and his.
My preferred pronouns are masculine pronouns. I identify as a trans guy, sort of gay identified trans guy. Him.
I identify as a male to female trans person. I would call myself a trans woman, and I use female pronouns.
Pronouns are the bane of my existence. And the reason for that is because there just isn't language to adequately describe people like me. Most of my life, I've answered to feminine pronouns, she, her. And on some level, I always cringed every time I heard that. Now think about that for a minute. Think about what it would be like to internally cringe every time somebody directed a pronoun at you. And that's been the reality for most of my life. As I came to terms with my transgenderism and being trans, friends, good friends, started using male pronouns. And for a long time, that felt really awkward too. On one hand, it felt good, it felt refreshing, but it was also very strange because he did not really describe me either. So, what pronouns do I prefer? The short answer is I prefer male, but I don't demand it. Adolescence may be an especially difficult time in the lives of transgender people. As a teenager, the stress of dealing with a body that is incongruent with one's inner feelings can lead to negative health outcomes.
As an adolescent, I know my parents sort of picked and kind of prodded at my gender expression at the time. They weren't a big fan of it. So I know a lot of trans people kind of go through similar scenarios where they express something of what they want to express as far as their gender identity and expression. And people in their lives kind of tell them no. You can't wear that, you can't do that.
Adolescence was difficult for me because my stepfather was not comfortable with my early expression of identity, and I knew I had to hide it from him to avoid I guess, sort of like kind of violent reprisals. And so I started seeing therapists for it when I was, I think, 18, 19. And my therapist insisted that I be able to move out and become financially independent before she would write a letter for hormonal transition. And I think if parents don't accept their children's identities, then adolescence can be really difficult because you can be thrown out, you can be pushed out on your own, or, you know, you can just like have to leave kind of early, like I feel I did, to be able to be who you are and take steps that you need to be okay and healthy and safe and comfortable in your body.
Adolescence was a particularly tough time for me, as I think it is for a lot of trans people. If you think about it developmentally, adolescence, particularly early adolescence, we're all still in a place developmentally of concrete thinking. Things are black and white. And so consequently, adolescence is a time of real gender intensification. You know, boys are supposed to act this way and girls are supposed to act this way. Now that's always there from birth on, but it really gets intensified at about junior high age in there, where the girls really start acting like girls and boys get real macho, and the sexes really divide there. And so for a time in my adolescence, I tried to do the right thing. I started wearing dresses and makeup and going to school that way, and I felt absolutely ridiculous. It just did not fit me. And it really didn't help anyway, because people still made fun of me, people still teased me, because even though I was trying, I was still a guy in a dress. And even though people consciously couldn't put it in such concrete terms, they knew that's what was going on. So it's a tough time for trans people. And it's also tough because adolescence is a time when you're really trying to find yourself. Who am I? You know, what is it that I'm really about and I really believe? And we try on a lot of different hats, and we try to figure out who we are. And what I am, according to society, does not exist. So it's a very difficult time for a trans person. Transgender youth may struggle to find the health care and mental health services they need due to the stigma and discrimination that can result from ignorance and misunderstanding. Medical professionals typically do not receive education on transgenderism or training on how to serve trans people. As a result, many feel especially uncomfortable discussing gender issues with young people.
The way that it's set up, at least to even access care as a trans person for being trans, is an issue. Just walking into a medical clinic for me gives me a lot of anxiety because I have no idea what I'm going to be asked or even how to fill out paperwork. I don't know if going into my endocrinologist, they're looking for me to write F or M because I don't know what they're looking at. Are they asking about testosterone levels? Do they really need to know, exactly what my chromosomes are, because chromosomes are problematic anyways? So it's a struggle.
A lot of physicians can be really insensitive. One time when I had a UTI, it required a swab because the physician was just dead certain that I had chlamydia. And he was really not gentle with me, and I told him I was a trans woman, and he said, "That's okay, man. I did my residency in New York. I've seen it all." So, and then, shoved a swab inside me, and I think that's the only time I've ever actually screamed involuntarily in pain in my adult life.
Because I sort of pass as a white guy and don't have to deal with a lot of other forms of structural, oppression and things like that. There are a lot of ways that transness doesn't sort of affect my daily life, but I think healthcare is the major piece that I feel like still really scares me. There are these stories from, Trans Day of Remembrance and stuff like this about, trans women of color in particular sort of being left by EMTs to die. And so I think the idea of having some sort of emergency medical situation terrifies me. I generally my general sort of interactions with healthcare providers have been around allergies, so it hasn't been a huge deal. But I'm not getting the sort of yearly checkups that I should be having because I don't really know of any doctors around here who I would trust with that sort of stuff, like whether you're like feminist or sex positive or like, having some awareness of trans issues. I don't know of doctors around here who could do that. A friend of mine has made an appointment to go up to the Chicago Women's Health Center for, sort of gynecological care and asked me if I wanted to go with her. And I realized I should probably do that. I should probably make an appointment in some place that's more sort of feminist or queer positive or something like that. But I also realized that even though I would sort of trust people there to be aware of my medical needs and not make, sort of transphobic or homophobic assumptions about my body and my sex practices, that still feels like it's going to be a very difficult experience at this point. It's always sort of awkward to be having some sort of gynecological exam, but there's something about it that feels like a little bit traumatic to me still, even though I would be going there because I trust them,
I showed him the letter that I had from my therapist, and he said, "Oh, that's cute, but I don't really require a letter." And he saw my name and said, "Jane, is that what you want to be called? Okay." And he called me Mr. Waldrop a lot for the most part, until one day he came in to announce that my testosterone count was under 60. So when he came in to announce that my testosterone was suppressed, he called me Ms. Waldrop for the first time, and he indicated my breasts and said, "Are you happy with those?" And while he was listening to me with a stethoscope, his hand found one of my breasts, and he started playing with it and jiggling it and just sort of toying with it. And I blushed, and he said, "That's some pretty titty there." And I crossed my arms over my chest and ducked a little bit reflexively. And he just said, "Oh, I'm sorry, are those still tender?" I don't know what I said after that, but that was the last time I went to see him. I didn't have any further contact with him. I just went to see a new doctor in Austin. And later I got a letter in the mail from him saying that I was discharged from his care because we had had no contact, which I guess was thoughtful of him.
There are all of these forms that just sort of make assumptions about the relationship between genitals and genders, right? So if you're talking to someone who has a uterus and you have particular questions about a uterus or a cervix or a vagina or whatever, you can talk about that without saying women's anatomy or assuming that the person who has those parts is a woman, right? Most of the people you see who have those parts are going to identify as women, but some won't. And if they see that you have a form that removes those references to being a woman or having a particular gender, that opens up much more space to feel comfortable and have more honest discussions. So if there's any room for sort of evaluating forms and really basic language like that, that's really helpful. There was another unit there that was thinking about they had 2 separate sheets for the instructions for urinalysis sort of collection, right, for urine samples. And so instead of figuring out do I think this person has a penis, I'm going to give them the instructions for if you have a penis. They were just going to print them on 2 sides of the same paper and just give the paper to the person and let them look at the side they wanted to look at, right? So that helps, any of those sort of simple ways you can deal with the sort of forms and the paperwork to open up more space, I think would go a long way towards making trans people sort of feel more welcome and feel a little bit better in those spaces.
Something that I've found interesting is treating it less like a disease and more like a just sort of naturally occurring medical condition, like pregnancy, oddly. So the idea of kind of having that kind of similar thing, treating it as though it's a naturally occurring, which it is, just sort of amazing thing that happens on occasion. Yeah, just kind of treating it like that, like it's completely normal, though normal is a loaded word, sort of occurrence.
For people who would like to know more about transgenderism and how to be sensitive to transgender people. There's a lot of good information on the internet. The Kinsey Institute and the Kinsey Confidential website have hosted some wonderful pamphlets made by a person named Sky Brown that offers a lot of basic overview of what transgender means and how to be a good ally and be supportive of transgender friends, families, and people that you meet. So I would say do some research on the internet, and if you're directly interacting with a transgender person and you're not sure what pronoun to use, what name to use, if it's okay to ask this question or that question, if you just ask politely and respectfully, I'm sure the person will be able to meet you halfway with that.
I think there is an incredible lack of education that's done in medical schools. And I think the medical community, just like society at large, is woefully ignorant on these issues. And I think an awful lot of practicing physicians and nurses just don't understand this phenomenon. And like the rest of us, they've been raised in a society that says you're either one or the other. And if you're this, that means you have to be this way. And if you're this, it means you're this way. And as a society, we get very nervous around people who don't conform to that. And medical people often are no different. You know, they see what to them looks like a guy in a dress or a female who's being way too masculine, and inside they go, ugh, what is this? You know, that's a response most of us have. Even as a trans person, as a young person, I had that before I really understood the nature of what I am. And so because of that lack of understanding, that lack of education, I think there's a lot of knee-jerk reactions that come from medical professionals. And it's directed at the transgendered person. And we don't need it. We have enough on our plate dealing with who we are and trying to make our way in a society that says we aren't possible.